this class, going through subnetting and the OSI model. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch some of the other videos I posted in the announcements. Well, what I want to help you get the class with today is to get you off on a good start on the course project. Okay, this is an iterative project. It builds week upon week upon week. So if you don't start off on a good foot on phase one, then it's going to kind of throw you off on the rest of the phases as we go through each week. We're going to build this this project out, and really what it is, like I said, it's a business, it's a company, and we start with a couple of small networks. Subnets, we do some subnetting, then we're going to add a building, and then we're going to add some services to this network as we go, and then we're going to secure the network. So like I say, it builds. So that's why it's very important. I want to do this week one, phase one of your project. All right, let's get into this. Okay, like I say, phase one, the components of phase one is pretty simple. What you're going to do, you're going to set up the documentation and the way you're going to do your naming convention of the assets in your network. Now, I will tell you, this is very important in real world, because if you have a naming convention that's only makes sense to you, when other technicians have to come in behind you and work behind you, sometimes it gets very difficult. So the first part of this project, a big part of this, especially in week one, is documentation. Like I say, so you're going to generate your naming convention and your IP address schema. So it's for the company. So that way, as we build on it, you'll have an IP address schema that's going to work for you throughout the rest of the project. And then you're going to have to properly subnet the IP address that you're given to work with. Okay, and that's where we're going to spend some time today showing you how to build this out. And after that, you're going to then build this network in Packet Tracer. So you're going to actually lay out the floor plan in Packet Tracer with the logical network itself, and assign your IP addresses to the devices, and want to be sure everything works at the end of the day also in Packet Tracer. All right, so let's take a look at some of the components in phase one. So this first part, like I said, when we first start building this, we're going to start with two sections of this company: the accounting section and the executive team. Accounting section has 10 PCs, it's got one printer, and it has a server, right? So those are 12 IP addresses right there we know we're going to need. We look at the executive team. They've got 20 PCs. They also have a printer, and they also have a server. So right there's 22 that we know we're going to need just to support those two office areas. Now, what kind of network devices? We're going to use a Cisco 4321 router, as well as a couple of Cisco 2960 24 port switches. And as we build this network out, we'll continue to add components to the network. Now, thing to remember: the accounting department and the executive team will be on separate subnets, okay? Separate subnets. Very important to remember that. All right, let's get into this thing we call subnetting. Like I said, I've done some earlier videos. Hopefully you saw these tutorials on subnetting. I used a bingo analogy and really hopefully help you understand subnetting. Not going to get into that today because I've already got the videos out there in the announcements. So, for this project, right, we've been assigned an IP address of 172.16.x.0 with a CIDR of 24. Okay, that X that's the number that you've been assigned. Hopefully everybody knows your number is on the announcements. Also, I've assigned a number for everybody. You put your number. For this tutorial I'm doing here, I'm using the number 10 for my third octet. Okay, so I'm 172.16.10.0. That's what I'm using. We're going to have to break up this subnet into, this IP address into 8 subnets. Okay, so to get 8 subnets, what are we going to have to do? We've got to borrow some bits. We've got to borrow 3 bits. In order to get 8 subnets, we got to borrow 3 bits. And when we're talking about borrowing bits, what does that mean? Well, if we look at, and I know I lay mine out a little bit differently than some of the other videos for the class, just give you a different look feel of how to do this. So if we look at the octets, right, and really we're only working in this 4th octet, but I like showing the 3rd octet, breaking out the 3rd octet as well, because when we have a CIDR of 24, that's telling us that all these are zeros in the 4th octet. and all of these are the first, second, and third octet have all ones in them. So there are 24 ones or 24 networks, and right now we have 254 usable hosts that we could assign. 256 total. But remember the first and the last, the IP, the subnet ID, and the broadcast, you can't assign those. But total of 256. So that's why I like showing this third octet, right? So when I use this, what's this table really showing me? Okay, I can see my mask, how many bits, or what the CIDR is going to be, how many hosts, which is the total amount minus 2, how many subnets I get, and how it's incrementing. All right, so if I look at this initially, like I say, I'm hearing this orange, which means that I have a CIDR of 24. Well, if I'm going to have to subnet this into 8 subnets, that means I have to borrow 3 bits, or it means I'm going to take 3 bits from the 4th octet, and they will become ones. We'll make those ones, which would then give me back to 27, right? That's going to give me a CIDR of 27, which will give me a mask of .224. How many subnets will that give me? 8 subnets. How many hosts? 32, but I can only assign 30 per subnet. So what I've got, if you think about it, now I have 8 subnets with 32 IP addresses in each subnet. And if I do that math, what is it going to give me? 256. If you notice, all of these still give you 256. I can have 128 hosts, 2 subnets. I'm still going to get 256. I can have 64 hosts across 4 subnets. How many? 256. So you see, I'm always going to I'm just breaking up the usable amount of IP addresses, which is 256, across ever how many subnets I need to make. So that's what we're really doing with subnet. It's nothing complicated at all. So now what we've done, we borrowed 3 bits. So now I have 8 subnets with 32 IP addresses in each subnet. Now, what does that mean though? It kind of changes some things in my IP address as well as in the subnet mask or in the CIDR. So now my new network ID is 172.16.10.0 with a CIDR of 27. CIDR 27. All right. So what does this tell me? That tells me now my range is from 172.16.10.0 through 172.16.10.254. That is my entire range, which gives me with a CIDR of 225.224. So that is this is what I'm working with now, that I'm going to now break this up into 8 subnets. Now, to do that, this is what it would look like. So, you see, I would have 8 subnets. The first subnet is actually my network ID is my new network ID. So at 172.16.10.0, right? So that's where my subnet's going to start, the first one. Now, as you see, I'm incrementing by 32. Or every subnet's going to have 32 IP addresses. So then my second one would start at 32. 16.10.32. If I'm incrementing by 32, the next one is going to be 64, 96, 128, 160, 192, 224. And at 224, that's going to take me to the 8th. That's the 8th subnet. And that will be take me to my 254 IP addresses, 256, IP addresses. So that is what I mean when I say that we're going to break this up into 8 subnets. Now we've got 8 subnets, and now I can start assigning subnets. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. I want to be sure we lock in on what we're doing. We borrowed 3 bits. 3 bits will take us back all the way back to the .224 for the subnet mask, which gives us 8 subnets. 32 IP addresses per subnet, and then we just did the incrementing. We did incremented by 32. We're incrementing by 32. All right, take a second. Let that kind of marinate. Let it soak in a little bit. All right, good, enough soaking. So now you got your subnetting done. Oh, good, good. Now we want to build this thing in Packet Tracer. So we're going to go in Packet Tracer, and this is what your Packet Tracer topology should look like. You should have have a router with 2 switches. That's your 4321 router, and these are your 2 2960 switches. And then coming off one switch, you're going to have this side. If you want to be executive, it doesn't matter. But yeah, let's say this is your executive switch, just executive server, executive printer, executive PCs. Now, please don't try to put 20 PCs on your Packet Tracer. Just put one representative PC, and that's enough. Otherwise, it's going to get so polluted until no one will be able to read it. On the other side, this is, now we got another switch and the other components. So that now makes it easier for us to identify the subnets. So like I say, now we have 2 subnets. We have a subnet for accounting that we need to apply IP addresses to, and we have a subnet for the executive team that we have to assign IP addresses to. So when we look at the total number of IP addresses, if you remember earlier, I said accounting needed 12, right? But actually they need 13. Now, for them to operate, yes, they need 12. If you just do the math here, you got 10 for the PCs, 1 for the printer, and 1 for the server. But you also need an IP address for that interface, for your router interface, or your gigabit interface. So that's 13 total IP addresses I'm going to need to build this side of the network out. If I look at the executive side, right, I'm actually going to need 23 IP addresses. The same thing, 20 PCs, 1 printer, 1 for the server, but also don't forget about that gigabit interface, Ethernet interface on the router. It also, both of these have to have IP addresses assigned to them. So I'm going to need 13 for accounting and 23 for the executive side. So now that I understand that, I can go to the next step of actually assigning IP addresses. So if you remember from a couple slides back, we had these network IDs and we had the 8 subnets. So we're going to start with that first one and start assigning IP addresses. So we're going to assign the first subnet to accounting. Accounting is going to get that first subnet. So the subnet ID 172.16.10.0. If you know, you cannot assign that IP address. The ID cannot be assigned to a device or to a computing device. So the first host or the first usable IP address is going to be 172.16.10.1. The last usable or the last assignable IP address is going to be .30. Okay, and then the broadcast address is .31. Again, we cannot assign the broadcast IP address. So this is my 32 IP addresses from 0 to 31, from 172.16.10.0 all the way through 172.16.10.31. So those are my IP addresses that I have assignable. The CIDR, 27. How many do I need? I need 13 for accounting. The subnet ID, like I say, yeah, it's 172.16.10.0, CIDR 27, subnet mask 255.255.255.224. So now that I know what I'm working with, now I can actually start assigning these addresses. Best practice, I do start assigning the first assignable IP address to that router interface. So 172.16.10.1, I'm going to assign to that router interface right there for the accounting subnet. All right. Now I can start with the .2 through .11, if my numbering is correct, and that'll give me the 10 PCs. So yeah, so that's my next set. So now look at the printer. I'm going to assign the printer .12, and then I'll assign the server .13. So that is how I assign the IP addresses for this first subnet. Tracking? Of course you are, because you're a great class. All right. So now I've got IP addresses assigned here. Now I'm going to move to my second subnet. If you remember the second subnet of the 8, it's the ID is 172.16.10.32. It starts at 32. Why? Because the first subnet ended at 31. So this one has to start at 32. Nothing tricky there, right? So that tells me then that my first assignable is going to be .33. I've got 30 to work with. So my last assignable is going to be 62. The broadcast 63. So that's my addresses. Those are the 32 addresses that I'm working with on this second subnet that I'm going to assign to the executive team over here. So when I do that, this is what it's going to look like. Here again, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to that router. I'm going to assign the first assignable to the router interface, which is 172.16.10.33. And then from there, I can see the executive PCs. So I got 20 of those. So I'll start from 34 to 54. I think I got my numbering right, maybe 55 maybe. But yeah, so anyway, so I'm going to assign those 20 there. The printer gets the next one, 55, and the executive server gets the next one, .56. And they all have the same subnet mask because I subnetted everything the same. So that is how I'll assign my IP addresses to both of the subnets, the accounting subnet and the executive team subnet. So now what do I have left over? As you see, I now still have 6 subnets that I can use for expansion. My next subnet would start at 64. Why? Because this one ended at 63. 64, and then I can build that one out. And as we expand our network, we will use some of these other subnets. Now, the thing to remember in about week three, we're going to introduce something we call VLSM, variable length subnet masking. Okay, so in week 3, we're going to change up how we've been doing subnetting. So we're going to have to do some resubnetting again. Okay, it's going to change the schema a little bit. But for right now, this is how I expect you to see week 1, phase 1 of your project. To me, it's pretty straightforward. If you kind of walk it step by step, it should get you there. Now, once you get that done, the second major part of this entire project is the project report. Okay, the project report. This project report, you're going to use the same project report template, right? For every week, you're just going to keep adding. So phase 1 is a company overview. So with phase 1, I'm just giving you just an example of what it's going to look like. I don't expect you to write yours just like I wrote mine. But yeah, you're going to talk about what the companies do and how you plan to set up your network in phase 1. Phase 2, phase 1, you're going to talk about your naming and IP schema. This is what you name it. Like I said, I named my main router LAR4321-R1 because we're going to continue to add more components to this network. Also, your IP schema. Tell me how you came up with your IP schema as well. You're going to talk about your device documentation and configuration. How is your router configured? How are the switches configured? What type of configurations do you have in your PCs? So all of those things, we're going to add to this project. Then you're going to have a network diagram for phase 1. Now each week you're going to add. There's phase 2, which is week 2. As we build this out, you're just going to continue to add to that same document. So at the end, you should have one document that's got phases 1 through 4 already done. Filled out for across the 4 weeks. So what are you going to turn in? Pretty simple. You're going to turn in this weekly phase 1 portion of this network report and your packet tracer. Should be able to attach both of those in Canvas, and so they can be submitted. How to save your files? Here is a schema for that. So for your packet tracer, phase 1 _ packet tracer _ your student ID, and then your report. Follow that same schema. Okay, doesn't sound too difficult, does it? Of course not. Again, have any questions? please don't hesitate to ask. But want to walk through this step by step. We'll probably do a similar video next week for week 2 as we start to expand this out into another building. So again, any questions, just let us know. Have a great week. Looking forward to the rest of this class.